Before we get going, you guys, I want to thank you personally so much for being supportive of Gearist, for buying our hats, for showing us the love on social media, for sharing things. If you're not sharing, you haven't subscribed, please do so. And now, let's get into today's review. What's up, everyone? Brandon here from Gearist. And today we're going to be taking you in depth with the EM Trail N3 from Pearl Izumi. If you're a subscriber to Gearist, which if you're not, you should be. If you're a subscriber to Gearist, then you've heard us talk about Pearl Izumi running shoes before. And one of the things that we always highlight is how smooth the ride of these shoes is. Well, we're not really going to get into that too much today because after all, if again, you're a subscriber, please subscribe, then you can go back and watch all the times we've gushed about exactly how smooth this thing is, how you don't feel the transition from the mid or the rear foot into the forefoot. Today what we're going to talk about is this shoe right here, the N3 Trail, or the Trail N3 rather, from Pearl Izumi's Emotion line. This shoe is going down a road that a lot of shoemakers these days are going down, and that is kind of the antithesis of the minimal movement that was around a few years ago, and that is down a more maximally cushioned road, or a maximally stacked road. So without any further ado, let's start talking about this guy. The 3mm deep lugs, which we see right here, are actually really similar to its siblings, other trail shoes in the Pearl Izumi Emotion line. They fall kind of in a nice middle ground in terms of how technical a trail they can handle. I've had this on really smooth trails and really technical trails, both of which I'll talk about here in a few minutes, and they do an admirable job in both. The lug pattern and layout has been updated from other trail shoes in the Emotion line. In this case, they seem to kind of emanate out from right here, right at the center of the arch, going this way and going down this way, which makes it a more directional lug setup. In other words, the front 2/3 of the shoe, front from here up, makes it really appropriate for kind of grinding uphill, and in the rear third of the shoe it makes it appropriate for kind of slowing descents and things like that and keeping your body under control. I found this rubber to be a little bit more sticky than other shoes in the Emotion line from before, other trail shoes that is, and that's thanks to, I think anyway, partially this updated carbon rubber that they've got going on in the bottom here. It's also going to be a nice bump in durability. And relative to that, there's little to no wear. I mean, there's somewhere right here, kind of exactly where I would expect it to be, but it's very minimal at best. While, as I mentioned a second ago, I do think this is more at home on some buffed out single track or something like that with a few rocky sections, I did push this to its limits and take it on some really very rocky, very off-cambered and technical areas that I've been running around here lately as I get ready for Trans Rockies. And I have to say that even though this has a high stack height, which we'll talk about in the midsole section, and the lugs aren't super deep, it did a good job. I think it, again, is more comfortable on smoother trails where it's more runnable. In this case, it still held up very well and really just was more than I expected on those things. Moving into that midsole, as you may have inferred by the opening of this review here, this is all about the midsole. That's kind of the big story for the EM Trail N3. Now, the first thing I should say is that the material is an energy foam rim and core, which is going to keep you stable on surfaces that you need to be stable on, but it's also going to increase that maximalist-ish cushioning that's on this guy. Again, if you've heard us talk about any of the Emotion line shoes, whether it's trail or road from Pearl Izumi, then you know that they do opt for a firmer midsole. We've talked about this before, where they opt for a more mechanical cushioning as opposed to a material cushioning underfoot. And in this shoe, it's not a whole lot different, although I will say that of the Emotion trail shoes and Emotion road shoes, any of the Emotion shoes, which I've gone N0 up to now N3, all through the N1s and 2s and N3s, that this is by far the most cush shoe among them. The stack heights of the EM Trail N3 are 31mm of foam in the heel and 23mm of heel in the forefoot for an ostensible net drop of 8mm. Now, the trick to this is that Pearl advertises this as having a drop of 4mm. So where does the 4 and the 8mm kind of jive? Now, the first thing I will say is that the 31-23 are measurements that I got from Running Warehouse, and regardless, what Pearl says about this is that thanks to its dynamic offset, which basically means that the drop changes as you go throughout the gait cycle, but to be honest, when doesn't the drop change with compression of material in the rear foot as you go through the gait cycle? Just saying. But what it means is that initial contact, according to Pearl, is a 4mm drop, and then at mid stance is 7.5mm. What makes this a little bit confusing, even to me who's running these shoes and really likes the way they fit, is that again, as you go through the gait cycle, those measurements are going to change. As you compress this foam, this is going to become a little bit lower, and the offset from this is going to be a little bit less or greater, depending on how this is compressed. But regardless of all that, the thing that I will say once again about the shoe, which I'll touch on in the ride section, is how smooth the ride is. This midsole is really great. That slight rockered shape underfoot keeps you very, very comfortable, and a whip fast transition from the rear or midfoot into the forefoot. And the final thing that I will point out about this is the embedded ESS rock plate, which you can see right here. So you've got these, it's very dirty, I apologize. You've got these red sections in here, which are essentially just EVA foam that we see here, and then a slightly denser and heavier area right in there. It's kind of a gray. So basically the rock plate is right up here under the forefoot and even up a little bit more under the big toe there. As I mentioned in reviews of more Maximal shoes in the past, they're generally not something that I really gravitate toward. I prefer a lot of ground feel, and I'll touch on that in a few minutes, but it's not something that I'm going to reach out all the time. But this is something that I found creeping my way really kind of persistently into my everyday rotation. The first reason for this is that while a lot of more Maximal shoes, and I'll kind of hold it like this so you can get an idea of the foam there, a lot of more Maximal shoes have a risk of ankle roll thanks to their high stack height. Pearl's done a great job of having this wide base here, but not so wide that it becomes cumbersome or risks kind of either medial or lateral kind of bumping into your ankle or other things like that. Even on most off-cambered, like really off-cambered terrain, I felt myself very confident in the shoe, and I really enjoyed it. It wasn't something that I felt like, oh crap, here comes the ankle roll, and I never once rolled my ankle in this, which is surprising because I can roll my ankles in just about anything. The second thing that kind of had me reaching for this shoe is that while a lot of shoes tend to be super, super cush, as I mentioned, I don't really reach for that cush feeling all the time. I like a lot of ground feel. This is a firmer shoe relative to how much stack height you see underfoot there. It's not super soft in terms of a marshmallowy feel, but again, in concert with that rockered outsole and midsole, with that emotion kind of dynamic offset shape, you really feel a lot of smooth ride and mechanical cushioning that comes out of that. I should mention that this actually required a little bit of a break-in period for me. Out of the box, it was really firm, almost to the point actually of being kind of inflexible, and it's still not the most flexible thing in the world. However, at about 25 miles, there was really a point at which it started to work with my foot more and started to feel more like a shoe that had a little more response in terms of interacting with the ground. And not that it's got fantastic ground feel, but you could sense the fact that the shoe was giving you more back. It was responding to your weight, pushing down into the ground, and then giving that energy a little bit back to you. Lastly, with regard to the midsole, while the outsole is not necessarily meant for super rocky or technical terrain, I will say that between the ESS rock plate that's in here and the additional stack underfoot, this handled a lot of rocky stuff quite nicely. And again, while it kind of dens the ground feel a little bit, it also really protects the feet. With the uppers of the Emotion line, Pearl has really got it dialed in, and this is no different. The upper of this shoe rocks a single piece seamless construction. The only perceived seam is right back here, of course, but then also right where the collar transitions into the front mesh of the shoe, which is pretty typical even for seamless shoes. The main body mesh is made of Pearl Izumi's transfer dry mesh, which actually does a great job of keeping out debris, but also being breathable enough so the feet don't overheat. Keeping all this seamlessness together is a set of bonded overlays, which you can see right there. They're a little darker gray, kind of gray on gray, hard to see, but they keep the shoe nicely in place, keep the foot nice and locked down, and their key thing here is that they are not in an area which is going to rub. I haven't noticed any durability issues with the upper at all, and in fact, these seem to be one of the most well-placed layouts that I've ever seen in this. On the interior, additionally on the medial side, we saw this in the EM Road N2 version 3, maybe, I think. Anyway, we saw this right on the medial side there. It's hard to see in this light, but there are a series of stripes going like this, bonded overlays from the interior, which are very soft and don't aggravate even a barefoot, but moreover, they add a bit of medial stability on this guy. Not stability in the underfoot, kind of propping at the first metatarsal type of stability, but really stability of the upper to work with the rest of the shoe, which I think is, again, part of what makes this shoe with relatively high stack height very stable. The tongue is not gusseted, which is kind of odd to me. I'm kind of surprised by that, which is interesting because with such a good debris keeper outer dry mesh, you would think they'd want to keep it out from there also. But apart from dust, I did not notice anything ever making it in, even on some really kind of gravelly type of terrain. Keeping the foot in place is the sausage link laces, which we have come to see in a lot of PI shoes, and they route actually through 3 different lace loops on here, which is really, really interesting. The first one, we have the traditional one right there in the middle of the tongue, but then up at the top, you've got 2. You've got one on each side of the tongue, which prevents any sort of lateral or medial tongue drift. A really, really nice feature. Being that this shoe is meant for the long haul, clearly, there's quite a bit of foam around the collar. The tongue, not so much. The tongue is actually quite minimal and feels very nice. But around the collar, there's quite a bit of foam. Fortunately, it is packed in there in a more dense way. It's not so voluminous as to push the foot forward, which is really nice. However, if it were to be shaved down a little bit, I do feel like this is an area that might be able to save a little bit of weight in this guy. And also in the heel, we have a pretty rigid heel counter right here, which does a nice job of covering the entire heel, and is another reason why I think this does so well, even being so high off the ground on off-camber terrain. I've got about 50 miles on this shoe right now, and I have to say that this upper is really just dialed. They've done such a good job, and Pearl is one of those companies that with their running shoes, they seem to not really mess with too much. While you might see some aesthetic changes and a little bit of change of the layouts and things like that, overall, there hasn't been a whole ton of evolution with that, and they've only been subtle changes. That's because Pearl's got all these years of R&D going, this is what works, this is what doesn't. So they can take away little things and add little things just to make it that much better each time, and I really appreciate that. In terms of fit and sizing, the first thing I'll say is that this fits my size 11 foot fine, so whatever size you wear, you should be fine in this. Starting at the rear of the shoe, as I mentioned a second ago, nice firm heel cup here. It keeps things in place. It allows you to work with this to lock down the foot in there and keeps you stable on some off-camber stuff, regardless of the stack height of this. As we move into the midfoot, this is one of those places where the upper also had not a break-in period, but it was kind of like me figuring out my lacing period, and once that was there, I felt very, very secure, regardless of the fact this is, again, not a gusseted tongue, and I really enjoy that medial support on the interior there. That's a nice touch. And then comes my favorite part of the fit, and that is the forefoot. Pearl has done a really, really great job here. While, yes, it's not as wide as, say, like an Ultra or a Topo athletic shoe or something like that, they've done a great job in really making a nice rounded forefoot and toe box area. First, the forefoot across the metatarsals has a lot of room. It's not swimmy at all, but it allows the foot to get in there and just really spread and get a very comfortable purchase inside the shoe. Into the actual toe box itself, first you've got this sort of kind of flexible toe bumper up here, which does a nice job protecting you from things here or there, depending on how hard you kick it, of course. But what it also does is provide more shape to that area, provides a little more vertical wiggle room, but also keeps things just very, very comfortable and well-rounded, and I love this a lot. Now for the ride of the EM Trail N3. Before we actually talk about the ride, let me mention the weight here. This guy in my size 11 comes in at 11.8 ounces. This is not a light shoe. However, as I and a few other people think, this doesn't run as though it's an 11.8 ounce shoe. It doesn't feel super heavy on the foot, regardless of the fact that there's a lot of material underfoot. As I mentioned earlier, there was a break-in period of the shoe. Straight out of the box, it was very firm and pretty inflexible, and not kind of in the way that translates into race shoe-like responsiveness where you want that stiffness a little bit. This wasn't like that. This was just kind of stiff underfoot. However, again, at 25 miles, I felt like it had kind of a breakthrough. As for the weight, again, does this feel like an 11.8 ounce shoe? No. Is it light? No. But what I do think is that this transition right here, and again, we're going to come back to that smoothness as we always seem to do with Pearl Izumi shoes, it really helps that you're not feeling like the shoe flatten out on the ground and then you feel yourself have to lift it off the ground. This is something that really rolls through the gait cycle very well and really aids in kind of abating some of that perceived weight, especially for something that looks like it might be a little weighty. I've touched on ground feel a few times, and the ground feel in this is not great. Is it there? Yeah, sure, it is there. And I never felt myself roll an ankle, or I never felt myself really oblivious of what was going on around me. On groomed single track, this thing can go forever, and that's kind of what it's built to do. I mean, this is a shoe that really just wants to run, and even at times can get a little zippy feeling, if I dare say. However, on more technical terrain, that's kind of where the limit of this. It does well, as I've said several times in this review, but the depth of the lugs and somewhat of the lack of inflexibility means that it doesn't always handle a lot of that super technical stuff very well. Now I'd like to talk about the price of this shoe, which comes in at $135. Now, this is kind of an industry-wide thing, but I've noticed the general uptick in shoe prices of late. And while I think that's fine, margins are margins, they have to be what they are. Companies have to make money in order to reinvest in product development, to pay their employees and to make money because they're companies. I do feel like it needs to be a little more inclusive. I would be comfortable with this at $115. And again, this is not a Pearl thing. This is kind of a general running shoe industry thing. But since we're talking about this today, let's just kind of talk about this. $115, perfectly comfortable. If you've got the $135 paying to look for cushioning and protection underfoot, this is definitely a shoe that's worth that money. It seems that every time I review a more maximalist shoe, I'm kind of surprised at how much I find myself liking the overall experience. Is it a shoe that I'm going to reach for over something that's got a little bit less stack height, a little more ground feel? Probably not. However, I do think the people that are looking for more material cushioning underfoot, a little bit more protection, all that kind of stuff, are going to be very, very satisfied with this. And it's going to bring to light, once again with Pearl Izumi's really smooth transition, that dynamic offset, how important mechanical cushioning is instead of just material cushioning underfoot. I think that this N3 right here is a shoe with broad appeal that's going to get people into that Pearl Izumi Emotion shoe line, and it's going to get people on trails that otherwise might not really think about it because they're afraid of rocks underfoot and tripping here or there or what have you. I think this is a shoe that can be a really good utility shoe for a lot of people. We've got our question of the day coming up for you guys in 1 second, but before we give that to you, please subscribe to this channel and share it with your friends. Sharing is a huge way to spread the love. Let everybody know what's going on with Gearist, and don't forget the series we've got going on, including Ask Gearist and including Gearist Questions, where we ask you questions. Now, our question of the day is, what kind of cushioning are you willing to kind of cut it off? Do you have a low end? Do you have a top end? How cushioned do you want your shoe? And do you really notice a difference between material and mechanical cushioning? Let us know your answers down in the comment section below. Guys, thanks so much for joining us today. Follow us on all the socials, which you see right here. Visit Gearist.com. Let us know what's up. Use the hashtag #I'mAGearist wherever you're posting online, especially on Instagram if you got one of those new fancy Gearist hats. Guys, thank you so much for spending a few minutes with us today, and we will see you next time.